Back in July of 2013, I was doing a little solo backpacking around the Olympic Peninsula up in Washington State, with various stops in the Olympic National Park. A few days in, I happened to stop in Quinault and ended up on some random road that dead-ended on a beautiful spot at the edge of the Quinault River. It really was something to see. There was this old footbridge that led across the river, and it looked like something out of the Lord of the Rings. With it being July, it was way too hot outside, and there I am, all alone with all this crisp, clean, cool-looking water just sitting there in front of me. By that point, I don't think I'd actually washed properly for maybe 4 or 5 days, so I wasn't exactly feeling at my freshest. You can probably guess what came next. I drove my car all the way to the edge of the dead-end road, turned it around, just in case I needed to get out of there in a hurry, then started hiking down an embankment to the edge of the water with a towel in hand. I didn't have any swimwear with me at the time, but I made a note to pick some up in the future and figured a quick dip in my underwear would have me nice and clean without feeling too exposed. It sounds weird considering how deep in the woods I was. I mean, it seemed like I was totally alone. But heavy emphasis on seemed because, as it turned out, I wasn't totally alone. You know how people talk about that feeling of being watched? It seems like a total cliche, doesn't it? Like surely it depends on how paranoid the person is. Well, I'm not in the least bit paranoid, and I'd go so far as to say I'm something of an exhibitionist. I have friends that would rather pony up for a hotel just to use the bathroom, hence why I was backpacking alone. I didn't feel like I was being watched necessarily, so much as it dawned on me that what I was doing was just a bad idea. I couldn't work out why at first. It's not like great whites are known to swim up into the Quinault, but in the end, it just felt like I was too exposed, too vulnerable. I tried telling myself I was being irrational, but I just couldn't seem to shake the feeling. So, after just a few minutes of scrubbing, I climbed out of the river, then walked over to the spot I'd stashed my clothes and towel. As I'm walking up the embankment, keep in mind that I have my back to the other side of the river, and since I was at my clothes and towel, it kind of felt like I was at a home base. Yet just when that feeling of exposure and vulnerability was going away, I happened to catch a glimpse of something on the opposite bank. I honestly thought it was a bear or something at first glance, but it quickly became obvious that a bear was the least of my troubles at that moment. Standing on the opposite side of the river, a little higher up than me, was a man. It looked like every single item of clothing he was wearing had been hand-stitched and made from animal hide. His hair kind of looked like dreadlocks, but I later realized that some of his hair strands looked more like they'd been woven around twigs. He looked like a full-on mountain man. Like I remember my skin crawling when I saw my boyfriend playing that dumb cowboy game years later. He was obsessed with making animal clothes, and one of his outfits looked almost exactly like my peeping Tom. Only peeping Toms are just an annoyance, whereas I know this guy had other stuff in mind. After just staring at each other for a moment, totally surprised to have come across one another, the guy made a beeline for the rickety old bridge. At first, seeing that made me feel like I was going to puke. I was praying that the worst it'd get would be him shouting, "Put some clothes on," or something. But the fact that he wanted to close the distance without even saying anything to me, he obviously didn't have good intentions. I just burst into action and grabbed my car keys, clothes, and shoes, but they got tangled up in some blackberry vines, so I made the split-second decision to just leave my clothes and get out of there with my life. When I made it out of the blackberry bush, I could see he was crossing the bridge toward me rapidly. I got to my car, flung my door open just as he'd arrived. I locked the doors while he pounded on the hood of my car, just screaming and grunting non-verbally. The moment he went for my driver's side door, I hit the gas and took off as fast as I could. I looked back, and he was chasing after me. He must have run after my car for at least a mile until we faded from view. I was bleeding everywhere from running nearly without anything on through blackberry bushes, and I was wet, unclothed, shaking, and crying. Had I hesitated for just a few seconds longer, I don't think I would have made it out alive. Even typing the story out again all these years later, I'm starting to shake. I felt like I was being hunted. That is the only way I can describe it. I'll never, ever go back to that area. Since then, I always bring a hiking buddy with me when I venture out into the forest. That day is going to haunt me for my life. I've had many years of therapy, and that experience is still as vivid as the day it happened.
Hey guys, it's Rye Horror. It seems like many of you guys enjoy my animated stories, but only 27% of you are subscribed. If you want to see this channel hit 10k subs, then please like and subscribe. Now back to the show.
I'm a hydrologist, which basically just means I studied water for most of my 20s and somehow didn't go insane from the boredom. All jokes aside, it's actually much more interesting than you might think. And if you get a decent degree from a decent college, then your job prospects are actually pretty vast. We work with farmers to ensure your food grows. We work with treatment plants to make sure your water's clean. We also make sure this water then makes it all the way to the comfort of your home in plentiful supply and without being contaminated. We also do things like survey sections of a river that have the potential to be dammed up. With good surveillance, a dam can be a source of plentiful green energy without being too destructive to the surrounding flora and fauna. And it was a surveillance job that took me out to the wilds of Washington during the summer of 2017. And given the time of the year, it seemed like a pretty sweet gig. On the surface, it was a highly paying, high-pressure job that could make or break someone's $1 million government contract. But between you and me, it was a paid hiking vacation. I'd navigate around, assess the bedrock, make a few notes. I figured the whole job would take no longer than about 5 or 6 nights. That way, I could take my time, soaking up the pay as well as the sun. And I didn't last 3. By the evening of the 3rd day, I was hightailing it out of the woods as fast as I could, carrying only my car keys, my phone, and a survival knife. There's something going on up in the woods of Colville National Forest, and I think it might be very, very bad. The first day was when I arrived in a little place called Onion Creek, a quiet little town with a general store that I used to pick up a few last-minute supplies. When I asked the clerk for a good, quiet spot to park my car, the clerk was nice enough to offer me the free parking space around the back of the store, telling me he'd personally keep an eye on it while I was hiking up the pine-infested hills. The pines I was ready for, but the hills I was not. I like to think I'm quite an athletic guy, but my God did those hills take it out of me. Even walking in a snaking pattern to reduce the overall steepness, lugging my gear up the side of my first camp was nothing less than agony, and I slept like the dead that first night, having barely had the energy to get my work done. The next morning was more of the same, burning calves and a back soaked with sweat. But I was keeping positive, telling myself it made for one heck of a workout, even though I don't think I'd ever been that exhausted before. Worst part was just how bad I smelled, and the idea that I'd descend to the river, get nice and clean, only to be incredibly sweaty again by the time I got back to camp. It was like a hygiene-based Kafka-esque nightmare. I made do with baby wipes on that second night, promising I'd get an actual wash on the 3rd day, which would coincide with topping off my water supplies. So, the morning of the 3rd and final day, I wake up with a raging headache. I take some painkillers, put on my boots, then walk off into the woods to, do my business, only to find that my pee looks the color of Jack Daniels. I was seriously dehydrated, having rationed my water supply maybe a little too conservatively. I then take it upon myself to immediately hike down to the river, drink my body weight in fresh water, and actually get myself clean while I'm there. On arrival, I chug some water, then strip down to my underwear before immersing myself in the shallows, knowing I'd be able to change my boxers back at camp. I give myself a rinse, but as I'm getting up and getting out, I'd swear I saw something on the bank near where I'd left my clothes. I mean, unless it was a very isolated gust of wind, then something was definitely moving among the trees. I'm a little spooked, but having some deer watching me wash isn't anything to really worry about. So I just grab my stuff, towel off a little, then start hiking back up to camp. Later that day, as I'm out hiking, I start getting this god-awful smell from somewhere. At first, I was thinking it was me, like maybe my clothes just stank, or I'd been stealth sprayed by a skunk or whatever. But the further I walked, the stronger the smell got, until I was literally struggling not to retch at how bad it was. Then, right as I'm about to puke, I look up in this bid to get to higher, fresher air or something, and there it is. It was either a fox or a coyote, but in such a bad way that I couldn't tell the difference. It honestly looked like someone had caught the thing, then just beaten it to death before hanging it up in a tree. The only reason I could think for anyone to do that would be to, scare the foxes off a person's farmland. Brutal, but effective, I guess. But no, I don't think there was a farm for miles around. Yet it wasn't long before I realized that the fox/coyote thing wasn't the only corpse strung up in the trees. I kept walking, trying to get away from the smell. It was hot, so you can imagine how bad it was, but no matter which direction or how far or fast I walked, I couldn't seem to shake the smell of death. And like I said, that's because the dead were all around me. It got to the point where there was something strung up in every other tree in various states of decomposition. I spotted dead raccoons, rabbits, moles, and rotten weasels. Heck, I even think I spotted half a deer skeleton up there at one point. At least, I hope it was just a deer skeleton. After that, like I mentioned at the start, I basically just turned tail and ran. Didn't bother packing up my tent or anything like that. I just bailed back to where my car was parked in Onion Creek and just got out of there. I don't want to think about how much money I lost from walking away from that job. I'd type it out if I didn't think I'd puke all over my keyboard. But at the same time, I can't really think of a number that would make me go back out there and risk ending up like one of those poor animals, hanging in the trees.
Back in 2008, I was a student planning to go to university and needed some extracurricular stuff I could put on my entry applications. As most UK students know, one of the best to have on there is the Duke of Edinburgh Award. As part of this award, you have to embark on an orienteering expedition, basically a long trek throughout woodlands and rural villages following nothing but a map and compass. No GPS allowed. It's a teamwork experience, and you camp and overcome hurdles together, etc. I was out of shape at the time, so my uncle volunteered to take me out to the middle of nowhere to get some idea of what orienteering was like. We didn't stay out overnight, which is what I would need to do during the real thing, but we hiked 10 miles through woods and a small village in pretty abysmal weather. By the end of the journey, we were soaked to the bone and pretty miserable, looking forward to getting back in the car and heading home. For the last part of the journey, we were on a dirt trail heading uphill with bushes and trees on either side. We were marching onwards in silence at this point, until all of a sudden there was a rustling in the foliage to our left. From behind a large bush stepped an old man in a black suit with a red bow tie and dress shoes. He looked to be in his late 70s or perhaps early 80s. Very pale, with liver spots dotting his face and a grey and white comb-over to match. I was instantly weirded out. Who dresses like that to go into the woods? The instant thought is that seeing some guy at this age out in the woods in these clothes and in these weather conditions is that this guy has certainly lost his marbles. There was something else that took me an extra moment to notice, though, that puzzled me. He was bone dry, didn't even have mud on his shoes. We stopped in our tracks and just stared at the man for a moment, who appeared to be as frozen and shocked as seeing us. My uncle made the first move, taking a step towards him, asking if he was all right. The old man continued to stare for a moment, not moving even a twitch, then became suddenly very animated. It was like he suddenly snapped out of a trance. He began flailing his arms wildly, saying something awful had happened, and that a good friend of his needed help. He began walking backwards into the woods, motioning for us to follow him, which we did. We started off at a brisk walk, then escalated to running as we struggled to keep up with the old man. After a minute he disappeared ahead of us, but we could hear him and continued following the noise until we reached a huge slope. We stopped at the edge and looked down to see the old man standing at the bottom, motioning us, pleading with us to follow him. I remember looking down at the slope. It was probably a 40-degree angle and spanned for at least 50 feet or more and slick with mud. It looked like an accident waiting to happen, especially given there were no shrubs or roots to hold onto or anything. I remember looking down at the old man on the other side of the slope and wondering how the heck did he cross it so quickly and cleanly. I mean, at that distance it's hard to see any fine detail clearly at all, but I swear he didn't appear wet or muddy at all. Me and my uncle looked at each other, and I saw that he was getting as weirded out as I was. Despite my feelings, I made a step towards the edge, and was going to try and make my way down, when my uncle grabbed me firmly by the arm and pulled me back. "Something's wrong here," he said under his breath. We took a few steps back from the edge, and at this point the old man at the bottom started to get irate. He began pleading with us to come down the slope, telling us he needed our help. His friend was in trouble. My uncle shouted down at the old man that we would head back to our car and call emergency services. That professional help would be on its way soon, and they would have all the tools that they needed to help. The old man then got furious and began jumping up and down, demanding that we come down the slope right away, or there would be hell to pay. His voice changed drastically at this point. He was now practically growling his words, his hands bunched up into fists, pounding his knees like an angry toddler throwing a tantrum. I've never seen a grown adult fly into such a rage in my life. His eyes looked like they were on the verge of bursting out their sockets, his skin gone pale to red in almost an instant. We began to hurriedly make our way back the way we came in, his demands and threats getting less audible as we got closer to the trail. Once on the trail, we practically power marched the remaining quarter-mile or so to the car. All the while, my uncle was on the phone to the emergency services, explaining to them that there was a possibly mentally ill man wandering the trail. We were ordered to get into our car and await the police so that we could show them where we had encountered him. About an hour later, we met 4 officers, 2 of whom had dogs with them, and a pack of supplies like first aid and emergency blankets. We led them to the exact spot and then pointed the 2 officers with dogs in the direction he led us through the bushes, and the search lasted a weekend, but there was never any trace of the old man. Officers said the only trail they could pick up had been mine and my uncle's. They didn't find any footprints or anything belonging to the old man we encountered. This has been one of my weirdest experiences to date.
Hey guys, it's Rye Horror. It seems like many of you guys enjoy my animated stories, but only 27% of you are subscribed. If you want to see this channel hit 10k subs, then please like and subscribe. Now back to the show.
Here is some backstory. I live in a small town pretty far away from the main city, but it's still a part of it. I live in Karachi, Pakistan. Right next to my town is a rural area with farmhouses and animals and breeding places. In this rural area, a friend of mine owns a farm with a good amount of ammunition, which is very rare in Pakistan because of gun laws. But the friend happened to be from a gun-dealing family. They were staying at the farm that night, and it was only me, my friend, and a helper there. His cousin was usually there, as the cousin owns the farm, but he was off doing some work that night. Me and my friend were on the rooftop smoking cigarettes and drinking some beer when I noticed a large semi-truck approaching down the highway into the rural area. It came down the road, and just when it was about to make the turn to go onto the farm road, the headlights went off. That's when we knew it wasn't a friendly truck. My friend made a dash outside carrying a 9mm pistol, which was usually enough to scare people off. But just to be sure, I stood on the rooftop with an assault rifle. Our goal was to only scare these people off and not do anything stupid. Now, my friend made a big mistake, standing outside the farm, and some people shot rounds straight at him. As you can imagine, we were petrified. My friend ran to the other side of the road in a panic, no clue what he was going to do, and I shot a whole clip into the air trying to scare off these guys, basically saying we have larger guns as well. It seemed to work, as the guys left straight away, and my friend came up and we sat and smoked more, thinking about what we should have done. We were considering going to the police when the guard dogs began barking like crazy. These were well-behaved dogs that would not bark for any reason, and they seemed to be barking at cattle. I ordered them to quiet down, which they normally would do right away as they obeyed me, as I had trained them, but they didn't seem to budge. They kept on barking and biting the cattle when the helper let out a scream that was immediately hushed out. I actually thought that the helper was shot dead or something. I was scared out of my mind, so was my friend. I made my way down to find the helper lying on the floor with his head busted open. That's when I noticed the farm door swung wide open. One of the guys, or the robbers, had snuck into the farm and hidden among the cattle, looking for the perfect opportunity to open the farm door. I looked up to see my friend with horror in his eyes. The truck was approaching again. I'm pretty sure I almost crapped myself this time, knowing full well that we were not only about to get robbed, but probably killed too. I untied the dogs immediately, thinking they would provide at least a bit of help. My friend tossed me the 9mm, and I stood there shaking, waiting for a possible shootout death. That's when the luckiest thing I've ever seen happened. The police had been reporting shots fired and then made their way to the rural area. It was rural, so it took them quite a while, but their timing was amazing. The red and blue lights possibly scared the robbers away, but they were like angels sent from heaven for us. We told the cops everything that happened, and the cops offered to stay with us for the night. We accepted it and told the neighboring farms about the lurking threat as well. Thankfully, nothing like that ever happened again. My whole life, my mum was single and tried hard with the best of intentions to find me a suitable father figure. My own father is a homeless drug addict who was out of my life long before this. I was about 10 at the time, and we were visiting a friend of hers who had kids that I got along well with. Her friend was always trying to hook up my mum, also with good intentions. We had been visiting all day and it was getting late, and I was tired and ready to go home. I go through the house and find my mum on the patio talking with the guy she was to be hooked up with that night. As I stepped out onto the patio and set eyes on him, I was immediately stricken with a deep-seated feeling of dread and wanted nothing more than to get my mum away from him as fast as possible. In fact, looking back at his face, he almost seemed evil in a way I cannot explain. As this hit me, I tried to stay calm, and I asked my mum to come inside so that I could speak with her. She came inside and I told her I wanted to leave as soon as possible, sensing that I was feeling distressed for some reason. And being the great mum who always listens to me in situations like this, she said okay, and soon after we left. As soon as we were on the road, I told my mum exactly how I felt and that I didn't want her to ever see or speak to him again. Once again, not wanting to upset me, she said okay and didn't speak to him again. Maybe 6 months later, my mum's friend calls to gossip as they frequently did, and she tells my mum that the same man from the night was now in prison. He had gotten together with a woman who had 2 kids, and one night he ended up locking the kids in a closet in the same room, and he had their mum tied to a bed and repeatedly raped her. My mum was sitting on the floor of the living room reading the newspaper, as she usually did while on the phone with her friend, and I was on the couch next to her watching TV. And I will never forget the look she gave me as she told me this news. While I was in university, I took my motorbike down to pick up my wife, who was my girlfriend during this story. She worked in an office building downtown and was fortunate enough to get off work early on Friday afternoons. So I hopped on my Kawasaki Ninja and headed downtown. I called my girlfriend with the comms unit attached to my helmet to let her know I was near her office building and looking for parking. She informed me that she would meet me at the food court in the mall that is across the street from her building. Now, for reference, I always bring my helmet with me no matter what. I learnt my lesson from leaving it on my bike and having it stolen once before. The other thing is, I had a second helmet in my backpack for my girlfriend. Safety first. The second helmet will become important later. After meeting her in the food court and having a meal, we wandered around the mall, looking at engagement rings and such. She found a ring she liked very much and, yes ladies, I ended up buying it. While I dumped my wallet out on the counter and imagining my bank account emptying, my girlfriend grabbed my arm and said, "Hey, the same 2 guys have walked past the store for the 5th time while we've been in here, and they keep looking at us." In order to relax her, I responded with the ever-clever, "They're just jealous because of how damn good I look in my riding gear. Really, it's a problem." Through laughter, my girlfriend proceeded to inform me that my sexy outfit made me look like a fat ninja. With the 2 guys forgotten and my ego obliterated, we left the store to make our way towards the bike. To get there, we had to go down 2 escalators, walk across the bottom floor of the mall, across the street, and into the lot of her office building, where my bike was parked. Just as we stepped onto the first escalator, my girlfriend suddenly grabbed my arm really tight and used her eyes to draw my attention to 2 guys directly behind us. I looked back at her, and with a slight nod, she confirmed that it was the same guys that had walked by the store. I took off my backpack and pulled the second bike helmet out the bag and handed it to my girlfriend so that we could hasten our journey. As we stepped off the escalator and made our way to the second one, I caught the reflection of the 2 guys in the glass window of the stores in the mall. They were behind us all right. I could hear them making comments about my girlfriend's appearance to each other as we walked, but not quietly. Their comments were loud for other people to hear. When we reached the second escalator, my blood was boiling. It took everything in me to not turn around and face the perverts head on. My girlfriend absolutely hates conflict, and out of respect for her, I kept my mouth shut and doubled our efforts to leave. While we were walking towards the exit on the main floor, I heard it. The sentence that will forever make me paranoid. One of them said to the other, "Let's kill him and take her." For the sake of your ears, dear listeners, I did not use the vulgar words that they used to describe their intentions. My girlfriend's grip on my bicep tightened like a vice, and then I heard it and saw it. She was sobbing, and I could see the wide-eyed fear in her face. I pushed her directly in front of me to force a faster pace out of the mall. We exited and started to turn the corner of the street, where we had to cross. My girlfriend kept looking back with a panicked voice, and she said, "They're coming." Hearing the fear in her voice made something snap. I shut everything out and went cold. As soon as we got out of the corner, I forced my girlfriend around it and went against the wall. I looked at her, and she looked right back at me. We ran. I took the helmet that she was clutching in her hands with a firm grip. She took off across the street heading for the bike, and I stood there waiting. I took the moment to get my helmet on for protection, and took the second helmet in my hand ready. I heard the sound of running footsteps coming down the sidewalk around the corner. What happened next may just be the craziest damn thing I've ever done. Before I continue with the story, ask yourself, if you heard those words from two perverts following you and your loved one, would you play it off as them being punks trying to scare you, or would you take it as seriously as a heart attack, like I did? These two threatened to kill me. I was okay with that, I accepted that. But what they threatened my girlfriend with, I refused to brush off. She was a victim of sexual assault before I knew her, and absolutely refused the smallest chance of something like that ever happening to her again. As soon as the two guys neared the corner, I stepped forward and gave them the universal sign for slow down by taking a swing. Let me be the first to tell you that when a motorcycle helmet meets a person's face, that's the start and the end of a fight. Period. No, I didn't end his life, but I guarantee the guy felt like I did. Pervert number 2, at my surprise, didn't even flinch at the sight of his body being destroyed. He threw some punches and I took those punches. We locked arms and he slammed me into the wall. I pulled my head back and headbutted the guy with my helmet on. He stumbled backwards and I seized the moment and kicked him on the side of the knee and threw some punches of my own. At this point, my girlfriend had made it back to the bike and had called the authorities. Being downtown, they came quick. Now here's the part I regretted. I grabbed the helmet I used to take down pervert number 1 and sprinted to my bike. I didn't wait for the authorities to arrive, with the story my girlfriend gave to the police. The two guys left broken on the sidewalk with lots of witnesses. I figured the smart thing to do was head directly to the bike and take my girlfriend away from the horror show. The two perverts ended up being arrested and taken away. Apparently they had a history with law enforcement. Luckily, I was not thrown in the back of a police car for being the first one to dish out damage. Witnesses, their prior offenses, and security camera evidence from them all saved my ass. I meant it wholeheartedly that I was willing to go to jail to protect my girlfriend from two predators. The following summer, we got engaged and I got her a new helmet. I threw the old one out as it was a constant reminder of that scary event. I'm not sure what the pervert duo are up to these days, but for their sakes, let's not meet again. Because if we do, you can bet your life I'll have my helmet with me.
Hey guys, it's Rye Horror. It seems like many of you guys enjoy my animated stories, but only 27% of you are subscribed. If you want to see this channel hit 10k subs, then please like and subscribe. Now back to the show. I sat in my police cruiser trying to catch a few winks of sleep. In South Africa, nothing is calm. There's always a robbery, murder, or rape around every corner. A police officer has his work cut out for him. But that particular day wasn't a work day. I waited outside a desolate house, sipping a coffee tentatively, every now and then to calm down my simmering nerves. I checked the windows of the house for any sign of movement. There was none. I sat back and closed my eyes. Memories came again. A flash, crash, glass shatters. My parents' bloodied mess of human beings, in the front seats, bone and flesh rendered into unrecognizable mess. I began to cry. I was only 5 at the time, and lucky to survive, but the memories remain vivid. I could hear the wail of a police siren. I continued to scream my lungs out, noises unfamiliar to me. Suddenly, I was picked up by burly hands and taken into a car. In the other vehicle involved, a man stumbled out, vomiting into the pavement, before he was roughly pushed against the police car and cuffed. A soothing voice then told me everything was alright, and soon I was at ease. I jerked up, eyes wide. It seemed a few hours had passed, the sky outside darkened by the evening bloom. I noticed the rustling of a window curtain. Someone was home. With hands shaking once more, I checked the pistol in my holster and left the car. I knocked hard, exclaiming, "Police, we want to ask some questions." There was no answer. I waited a few minutes, then I resorted to my only option. Drawing my pistol, I busted down the door with a kick, the stench of an unclean house hitting me instantly. When the dust cleared, I saw a figure in the corner, wearing nothing but a tank top. He was filthy, stained and greasy. He raised his dirty palms, quivering in fear. Surrounding him were dozens of empty beer cans and shards of broken glass. 20 years. 20 years had led to this moment. Scrounging every police database, filing through thousands of folders, I had finally found the drunk bastard who had killed my parents. One jerk of the trigger was all it would take to end his life, but I refrained, his miserable demeanor screaming mercy. I summoned the courage to ask the one question I had on my mind for so long. Why? The man looked puzzled and stammered. What are you talking about, sir? I clenched the grip of my pistol tighter, walking towards him. You killed 2 people 20 years ago, a mother and father. He made no response until I kicked him in the stomach. It was you, right? You killed my parents. Yes, it was. So why? Why the hell did you do it? I was drunk. I made a stupid mistake. I'm so sorry, sir. I didn't mean to. The simple answer infuriated me. There had to be something more than that. For my whole life to be turned upside down, surely there was a reason. Of all the people who could have been in the car, it was my parents. I kicked him again and readied my gun. Suddenly, he grabbed my leg.
I'm so sorry, sir. I had no choice. Please, I'll tell you everything.
My pistol never left his head, but I listened.
Your parents, they were rich, weren't they?
That much was true. They had been influential in the mining business, but I failed to see why that was important.
It was your uncle, sir. He paid me to kill them, for the inheritance money.
I froze. Lies! I yelled as tears blurred my vision. The man desperately waved his hands.
I have proof.
He pointed towards a drawer.
It's in there. Papers and letters. All of the evidence.
How was this possible? This had to be a ruse. My uncle had been the one who saved me. He inspired me to join the police. But there was a nagging feeling in the back of my head. I couldn't help it. Open it and show me. The drunkard complied quickly, digging through the mountains of dirty clothes, eventually withdrawing a small file of paperwork. With shaking hands, he handed me the collection, retreating to his corner again. I flicked through it, despair growing rapidly. Descriptions of my mother as a whore, my father as a scoundrel, and the words kill and inheritance highlighted in bold. And at the end of every letter, there was an unmistakable signature of my uncle, with the distinctive curvature unique to him. The final letter chilled me to the bone. Andrei Nikosi to be released and paid after his services. Every police officer involved in the operation to be granted $50,000. Son of whore and scoundrel to be rescued if possible. Otherwise, leave him to die. Is your name Andrei Nikosi?
Yes, it is, sir,
he answered, nodding emphatically. How much did you make? I pointed my gun at him again. However, this time, he did not cower in fear.
Nothing, sir. Does this look like the home of a paid man? I was just 17, and my whole world had collapsed. Back then, my parents had just died in a car accident, and soon I was evicted from my tiny apartment and was forced out onto the streets. For many months, I was cold and hungry as I sat there all alone, with no one to help me. It was a bleak future, and it looked like that was the end of my life. Just another victim of a tragic accident. Until your uncle picked me off the streets. He gave me food and shelter, and I know it was all for the wrong reasons, but all I could think of was to survive. But then after helping him, he betrayed me and tossed me aside like trash, only paid in broken bones and nightmares.
He closed his eyes as tears began streaming down.
But now you know the truth, sir, and I can die a happier man for it.
I holstered the gun. I don't blame you, Andrei. I felt betrayed. Rage was seething inside me. I couldn't believe how much of a scumbag my uncle was. The man I thought of as my hero turned out to be one of the most ruthless and evil bastards. To kill your own family, your own bloodline, for money? Within an hour, Andrei and I stood in front of the police headquarters. I gripped a list of names in my hand. Police officers that had took me under their wing, and guided me. Beside each name was a simple check mark and the word paid. We entered the building, Andre as the arrestee. To the other police officers in the building, I was just back from a patrol, a case of drunkard pissing on sidewalk in hand. Ignoring the cells, we continued walking up the stairs until we reached the office. I burst into the office enraged. My uncle looked up from his desk, eyes glad to see me. But when they turned towards Andre, I saw his eyes widen as the mug in his hand shattered on the floor. I took out my pistol and fired the bullet into his cranium. Behind me, there was a clatter of boots as the officers ran up the stairs. The yells of shock and horror filled the building. I checked my magazine and sighed. There was some cleaning up to do. 10 minutes later, I stumbled out of the building, my vision blurred. My clothes were soaked in blood. I wasn't even sure if most of it was mine, but what I did know was that my goal was finally complete. I slumped against my car, watching as Andre left the building. Instead of bolting off, he approached me. Simply shaking my hands, we locked eyes for a moment, and then he was off, a speck in the distance. I closed my eyes. There were no longer any memories of that fateful night. Instead, nothingness. As a kid, I loved collecting marbles, and to this day I am fascinated by every object that is spherical. I also used to work a dead-end job at Walmart, as a stocker, and when I needed to, as a cashier. It was Monday, and nearing the end of my workday. Looking at the clock, I sighed as the hours finally hit midnight, so I began closing the tills. The last customer was in the store, but something seemed off. The client was an older man and wore an eye patch, and seemed to look around him every now and then, twitching as he did so. I automatically assumed he was some druggie off the streets, looking for some shelter, but I didn't take any action, since closing wasn't until another half hour or so. Finally, he proceeded to the checkout, a loop of rope in his hand. He looked me right in the eye and asked me a question.
What happened in the aisle near the gardening section? The floor's wet with oil.
Tentatively, I grabbed the radio and called for the caretaker, the only other guy in the building. But he didn't respond, so I figured the fat bastard had left early. Finishing up the man's purchase, I watched as he left the building, and then I proceeded to where the oil spillage was. As I approached the end of the hall, I saw that there was indeed oil smeared all over the floor. Sighing, I walked over to the stock cupboard to get a mop, opening the door when I was abruptly shoved. The floor was slick with oil and I slipped hard, banging my head against the floor of the cupboard. A wet sensation on my hands. I tried pulling myself up, when I realized I was holding onto the janitor, dead and bloody. He was gagged and missing both eyes. The panic and despair took over me, crawling to the emergency exit. The customer suddenly appeared in front of me holding a baseball bat. And then he proceeded to smash me square in the head. Everything blacked out. Woke up a little later. In front of me was the old man, his eye patch lifted to show a grotesque hole, still bloody and raw. I was strapped to a chair with the very rope I had just sold him. His words came out in a frightening rasp.
Don't worry, son. I just need to borrow one of your eyes. You see, your friends didn't fit too well.
My heart raced as he brought the knife to my face, inches away from my eyes being forced open by his fingers. Luckily, the security alarm went off, probably due to the emergency exit having been left open for so long. The psycho tried to run away, but the supermarket doors closed automatically. I managed to free myself from the ropes, wriggling hard until they became loose. I rushed to the power panel and turned off the generator. The alarm stopped and the lights in the establishment went out. It was the opportune moment for me to act. It was dark and the man couldn't find his way out, so I followed him silently over the cereal cracks. Eventually, he found the emergency exit and started running towards it. Intercepting him, I tackled him from the side, wrestling with his hands, which held the knife so desperately. I punched him in the gut and he seized up, dropping the weapon. Without thinking, I picked it back up and, digging into his only eye, gouged it clean out. The shock was so great that he lost consciousness. I wasn't sure if he was dead, but I pulled his body out of the supermarket and took it to the back, where I threw it into the incinerator, where the garbage was usually tossed into. A few fiery infernos later, the man ceased to exist. I looked at my watch and realized it was time to leave. Shaking, I started to walk home. I needed to calm down and took out my marbles, rolling them in the palm of my hand. It was a soothing sensation and my breathing steadied, except one of these marbles was a lot bigger than the others.